Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a recent read for 3 books. Grey Bees by Andry Khurkov, translated by Boris Dralyuk. The Physics of Sorrow by Georgi Gospodinov, translated by Angela Rodell. And How to Find Zodiac, non-fiction, by Jarett, Kobek. So I'm going to start with the 2 fiction books. So I did want to read something by a Ukrainian author, and I'd read Death in the Penguin by Andry Khurkov a few years ago, and what a delight that was. Very sort of offbeat, wry humour about a depressed guy who lives with a king penguin or an emperor penguin, who is also depressed because obviously he's in an apartment in the Ukraine. This has a similar sort of melancholic feel, but without the humour. It's set in the grey zone, which is a zone between the pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine on one side and the Ukrainian forces on the other. In some places that zone is very close together, in other places it's several miles apart depending on the terrain, and they just shell each other across this zone, and sometimes of course the ordnance lands in the zone and wreaks damage. And this is one village in the grey zone, populated just by 2 men because everyone else has fled, and they are described as frenemies, that they're forcibly sort of come together because that's the only social life they have. And the main character is a beekeeper, hence Grey Bees. And it starts in the winter, and it's a fantastic description of just how tough it is to survive on a daily basis, even without being shelled. There's no power, there's no shops, there's just nothing. And these 2 guys have sort of, it reminded me of The Martian, but without that sort of frenetic energy of solving against things against time. This is just these guys going about day to day with meager resources, but surviving in a similar way that the Martian does. And I thought that was brilliantly done. Occasionally they are visited. The frenemy guy is pro-Russian separatist, and he gets visits from the separatist troops, and although the beekeeper is desperate not to be aligned with anyone at all, he does make friends with a Ukrainian soldier who comes down to visit him occasionally. So that's the first part. Then as we move through the year, and the bees are going to come out of hibernation, he wants to drive them to a place where there are no sort of detonations and explosions that would threaten the well-being of the bees. But it's almost as though he comes out of hibernation himself as he goes on this journey. So he goes further west into Ukraine where there is no war, but he's clearly an outsider. People see that he comes from the Donbass region, which is, they assume means he's pro-Russian separatist, which he isn't. As I say, he's absolutely desperate not to be aligned with anyone. And he does come out of his hibernation to some extent, but he's also forced on the run by the politics of it, and then he goes down into the Crimea, which is currently fully occupied and controlled by the Russians, but he hooks up with a Tatar family there, and the Tatars are the sort of the Muslims in the area, and they're also outsiders to the Russians, who oppress them, and again he sort of falls foul of the local politics there. I did think that while it was interesting, all these different peoples and outlooks and allegiances, the first part of the book was the strongest, just because it was somehow much more, even though it was just day-to-day surviving and just doing everything to keep your head above water, somehow it had more energy about it than the rest, which just seemed this sort of peripatetic journey, and he was very much at the whim of the people around him. I just felt that was slightly less satisfactory, but it's still a very, very good read. But it is pockmarked throughout by melancholia, and this guy's 49 years old, and he's going on 60, 65 because of the circumstances in which he lives in. So 4.5 stars. And on to Georgi Gospodinov, The Physics of Sorrow, and what an absolute 5-star delight this book was. It's kind of hard to describe it. I've seen it described as postmodern, which I don't think it is, although there are elements of autofiction and it's non-linear. I don't think it's particularly concerned with its form. It's just how the author has chosen to arrange his material. And it starts off with a boy who is so empathic that he can actually enter people's minds into their sealed memories that are secret even from them, or they are keeping secrets, and he's able to penetrate these secrets. And he starts off entering the mind of his grandfather, who has a wartime secret of abandonment of somebody. And this boy already feels abandoned by his own parents because they're on the move from apartment to apartment. Often he's left alone to bring himself up. He's in this basement where the windows look out onto the feet and ankles and shoes of the pedestrians. And he feels like he's in the basement or in a labyrinth, hence there's a lot of Minotaur themes here. So he feels abandoned already, and he's able to extract from his grandfather, who he loves, a story of abandonment, 50 years ago or however long it was. That sets up the book brilliantly, but it's not a book of plot. It's just a book about reflection and insight, and feeling, and it's just brilliantly done. It's wonderfully written. Lots of motifs or allusions come back, are woven back in, but not in a sort of crass way. It's just an absolute delight to read. He has a couple of other books which I think are in a similar vein, but I was so beguiled by this that I think I will definitely pick up his others, although they're not that readily available at reasonable prices, but it's just a case of keeping your eye out. So there's not a lot more that I could say about this other than how good it was. And then on to Jarett Kobek's How to Find the Zodiac, the follow-up to Motor Spirit, The Long Hunt for the Zodiac, which I talked about in last week's recent reads. I will post the link to that. I think it's important that if you're interested, you probably do need to read that first and then pick this up, which is obviously what I've done. So this was about the sort of the culture and the atmosphere that basically germinated Manson and Zodiac and people like that. It's about California in the 60s, about the culture and about media particularly. This is something different in that it's a deep dive into one individual psyche, albeit placed within the culture or a microculture of the times. So very early on, Kobek gives us the name of someone who may or may not have been Zodiac, who it won't mean anything to you or me. It's just an ordinary Joe who was married to the same woman all his adult life, lived in the same house with his wife all his adult life, but had this huge other life. Now, normally you'd say it was an online life, but this was in the 60s where there was no internet. So this is a sort of book about the internet before there was internet, where this guy was an obsessive writer to fanzines and a producer of his own fanzines. And that's one of the points that is really illuminating, is that, there was cosplay as early in the 60s, because Zodiac's fourth killing, he wore a hood. And, it's possibly, Kobek, theorises that it was something that he wore to a medieval fair. It was a homemade executioner's hood. And on the way back from this fair, he then committed the murder of one and the severe wounding of another, which is why we know he was wearing a hood, because that witness survived. It's cosplay. Fanzines, I associate fanzines as arising in the 70s in punk and then in the 80s with, football fans. But, no, there were science fiction fanzines from the 40s onwards. Fan fiction we associate as, again, a sort of online publishing phenomenon. No, there was fan fiction through these fanzines where they would take, inspiration from existing sci-fi and pen their own. So nothing is new under the sun. We just think it is. And this guy, Paul Durr, participated in this in this fanzine world. Now, these fanzines were mimeographed, 8 pages long or whatever. They're, most of them haven't survived, and Kobek does a remarkable job digging up what has survived and making the links through them. And this guy Paul Durr reveals himself through this prodigious writing. Now, he reveals himself, but he also lies, as Zodiac lied. What you get, as I say, is this huge deep dive into this character, into this psyche of a man through his own words, be they true words or be they not true. And they're an odd mix. A lot of the writing comes accompanied with classified ads that he placed for things, for sale or wanted, objects, including guns. But also there were these very strange ads where he was sort of calling out for women to join him in a remote cabin that he owned. This sort of mad implied sort of sexual fantasies that he had. And yet we know he lived with his wife, quite happily, throughout all his life. He also wrote about living off the grid, be it on a boat that he would sail around the world or in this remote cabin. He sort of had sort of rants about things like the fluorination of water. He would write technical, answers to people. He was a member of the Minutemen, which is a right-wing militia, which may have given him practical information on things like bomb making and assassinations with and silencers on guns and things like that, but certainly seemed to have chimed with his political beliefs. Some of his writings, his creative writings or his comments are, we need to reduce the world's population through killing, and others are, hippie, love your fellow man. So it's a real morass, and as I say, the information that Kobek provides us is extraordinary. This is going down rabbit holes. And I know Kobek would have used the internet, but it is going down rabbit holes in pursuit of analogue material. And in a way, Kobek takes one for the team, for all of us readers, because this is a depth that I don't see very often in so-called non-fiction. It gets you inside the psyche of a man without ever drawing conclusions. One of the things Kobek is at pains to say is this guy may or may not have been the Zodiac. The Zodiac was a self-created, self-constructed, partly fictional being. Yes, he committed the murders, but he created this huge story over and above it, sort of superstructure of a myth. Paul Durr, as represented in this book, is fictive in that not only is Kobek saying he may or may not be, the Zodiac, but he creates his own sort of myth about himself. And then Paul Durr as Zodiac is itself a myth that Kobek is at pains to say, I'm not perpetrating this myth, it's just a possibility. So this is how Kobek summarises it. Durr was the one individual in the San Francisco Bay Area who shared a near identical body of knowledge with Zodiac. These things happen. It was not impossible that two individuals in the same region, of the same rough age, had the same hobbies and tastes. God is a hack screenwriter. Durr repeated himself, and Durr liked to be the smartest person in the room. He was an autodidact with a library card. He lived with an intolerable knowledge. Durr knew correctly that he was much smarter than the fancy lads from Harvard and Yale. But he also knew that something kept the world from acknowledging his intelligence. There is a presumption in being the man who offers unsolicited information. I know something that you do not. It's there in a letter to Tournaments Illuminated, a lecture about basket hilts to the people who spent 4 years researching and dissecting medieval weaponry. He'd thrown in a factoid about ancient Rome and the steam engine. I know something that you do not. In all of Durr's writing there was a constant and burning desire for recognition. Kobek suspected that this yearning motivated most writers. A long time ago, Kobek suffered the affliction. Now he could see it in others. The writer was like a dope-sick junkie rolling into a new town, walking down Main Street and discovering in less than 5 minutes who's holding. Look at me, here I am gifted. Why won't you see that I am gifted? So there's lots of things going on there. Kobek writing about himself in the third person. Also, that although as I keep saying, this is in a pre-internet age, it is all about the internet as well. Look at me. I want to be famous for 5 minutes or 15, as Warhol said. And in this, the figures who were sucked into the Zodiac, such as the media who were written to by Zodiac, the detective who was investigating the case, they had their 50 minutes of fame on the back of Zodiac. But Zodiac has been going for 50 plus years. His myth persists. It's a fantastic book. As I say, you don't get that level of detail and insight into a human psyche, whether it's fictional or real, in a memoir or whatever, that I've ever come across. It does a remarkable amount of work making connections across all these rather obscure sources of fanzines on different subjects, which makes it a bit of a slog. But as much as if it's a slog for us reader, well, imagine what a slog it was for Kobek to put it all together. And I think it's worth, if you're interested in the subject of Zodiac or what makes a serial killer, whether Paul Durr was Zodiac or not, I think this is absolutely worth your time, and you'll appreciate the level of detail in it. And 5 stars. And yet a very different book from Motor Spirit, which I loved Motor Spirit in a different way because it's telling me about the culture. Here, this is telling me about one man, one psyche. Yes, within a very small subculture of the fanzine world, but the insights derived from that are extraordinary. Okay, and just to say what I'm currently reading. So we are in March. I've started my mammoth book, which is J.R. by William Gaddis, which I am buddy reading with Fraser Simon. Our first check-in is tomorrow, Monday, so we haven't talked about it yet. That will dominate the early part of March. It's scheduled for 3 weeks to complete, but it's Gaddis, so it takes a while. I've got some very exciting books due to arrive from the post, which have been recommended by other booktubers that I've watched and got very excited by. I may hold those up to the camera once they arrive. I may not. I'm looking forward to sinking my teeth into those. Okay, so till next time. Thanks very much.